I started out to speak about the environment in my book and the depredation of our environment by economic interests. But in order to do that, I realized that I would have to support my position with historical fact, historical data. And so I went back quite far in history. In fact, basically to the early Pleistocene, about a million years ago, when Homo ergaster came down out of the trees, started forming families and bands and clans and tribes, nations, and city-states, nation-states. And then I wanted to discuss how religion played into that, and which actually started out, like as I said, a million years ago or so, as a belief in deities, not in any sense an organized religion, but in the sense that people needed a pantheon of religious deities to believe in order to get them through the hardest times in human history, like the ice ages and in times of famine and so on. And so from there, organized religion soon developed around 10,000 years BCE, before the Common Era, and societies began to organize in hierarchies where you would have, the warrior chieftain leader at the top, supported by a priest class, and below that a class of artisans, and below that basically everyone else. And so it was around the medieval periods, with the age of discovery, 1492 and so on. After that point, Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World, as it were, and adventure was supported by the church, of course, the Catholic Church, and of course it was their intention, it was the intention of the Catholic Church to get their share in order to enrich themselves. And in order to do that, various popes throughout history established edicts, beginning with Pope Nicholas V with his Edict Dum Diversis in 1452, and then there was Pope Sixtus IV in 1479 with his Aeterna Regis, his Edict Aeterni Regis, and then in 1493 Pope Alexander VI with his Edict Inter Caetera, which basically split the planet in two hemispheres, east and west, and gave the Portuguese half, the eastern half, and the Spaniards the western half. And from there, it was established as part of these edicts that any non-believer could be enslaved by these adventurers. So they would go into primitive regions of the world where there were civilizations established and take them over, basically, militarily take them over. And, enslave the people that they wanted to enslave in order to work in the mines and in the fields. And then they would use those profits to enrich themselves. But let me go ahead and I'll start with the prologue here. The name of my book, of course, is Dystopia, which is what I believe is the current state of our world today. And so I'll just go ahead and start reading this. Dystopia is a polemic, a prognosis, and a prescription based on historical and current fact. And what I'm seeking is nothing less than humanity's apotheosis, or as Voltaire's Candide had it, le meilleur des mondes possibles, which does not have to be a world without humans, only a world with a limited number of humans doing less. In Dystopia, we will look back from our current state, dystopia, deep into humanity's prehistory, and then to one of two possible futures, one that holds total global annihilation through overpopulation, hyperdevelopment, and environmental collapse, or a future in which humans have learned to exist in equipoise with nature and with one another through transcendental collective asceticism and responsible economic degrowth. Centrally at issue in Dystopia is how the global corporate state systematically classifies, racializes, and as necessary marginalizes people through social engineering in order to convert them into a compliant, fungible, collective resource in the furtherance of infinite economic growth, even to the demise of life on Earth. Now, in the global corporate state hierarchy, there's also the welfare security state, which is, subordinate to, to the main, global corporate state. And I'll talk about that at length as time allows. Okay, so part one, the underclass, global history and prehistory. As Charles Bukowski said in Barfly, the movie Barfly, hey baby, nobody suffers like the poor. Okay, so first of all, you may be interested to know the reason I chose dystopia as the title for this book. I wanted a word that would lend itself well to irony, possibly one of the oldest survival mechanisms known to man since man developed a sense of humor. I wanted a word that would convey how we in the underclass feel as witnesses to a world spinning out of control due to the folly of its leaders and their adherents in the consumer class, who stubbornly and idiotically ignore the cries of the prophets whose words, as Paul Simon once penned it, are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. I wanted to explode the popular myth that we in the underclass, as a class, are just a bunch of worthless eaters who know nothing and don't know what we are talking about, and I wanted to show that each of us is intrinsically valuable simply by virtue of our existence, or as Thomas Jefferson framed it in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, that all men are created equal, quote unquote. That we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, principal among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, insofar as Jefferson saw it as self-evident that all men are created equal instead of all men and women, or that all life is created equal, I think a point could be made that with his Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, who was an ardent anti-federalist, set the foundation for the creation and ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1789 and 1791 respectively, and subsequently more or less equal rights for all Americans. And regarding the notion of creation with a capital C, although Jefferson was a rationalist in his views toward religion and God, which in his time was considered cosmopolitan to say the least, there are at least a few humanists who today see Jefferson, and by extension America's affinity for religion, as old-fashioned, and I count myself among them. For those who believe in nothing save their own corporeal existence, and perhaps the existence of the person standing next to them, it would seem to make more sense and would certainly simplify matters that Jefferson instead held as self-evident that our unalienable rights flow to us not by the grace of some supernatural Godhead, but naturally from our biological mothers and fathers, as an inherent benefit of the institution of family, as progenitors and primary nurturers of civilization, gentium civilis. This, too, is my position. I would further posit that among our unalienable rights, although each of us in civil society has liberty, quote unquote, in all practicality, ours is a liberty by consensus and within reason. We are not free to do whatever we want. That would be uncivil. And finally, I ask, given the enormous pressure our planet is under due to human overpopulation and hyperdevelopment, by the definition of what it means to be happy within the parameters of global corporate state consumerist culture, wherein happiness is defined as the measure of one's personal ambition, productivity, and accumulation of wealth and property, had we really ought to continue to ascribe to ourselves as not merely Americans but as global citizens a supernaturally endowed unalienable right to the pursuit of unbridled happiness, even at the expense of and to the detriment of our neighbor's happiness? Or are we required by Rousseau's unwritten social contract to content ourselves in the pursuit of, simple ascetic contentment? As the 18th century Irish reverend and philosopher Francis Hutcheson opined in his 1725 treatise, An Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue, action is best which accomplishes the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers, and worst, which in like manner occasions misery. And as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy said of our unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, today there is a hedonistic component to our definition of happiness. For Thomas Jefferson, according to Kennedy, Happiness meant that feeling of self-worth and dignity you acquire by contributing to your community and to its civic life. Here it is worth noting that at the time of its framing, according to noted political scientist James Q. Wilson, Jefferson actually substituted the words pursuit of happiness in his drafting of the Declaration of Independence for pursuit of property, as Jefferson's contemporary and friend John Locke intended. But in any case, thanks to our country's Declaration of Independence, you may rest assured that in America, you have a right to be happy, even an unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, and even to the expense of and to the detriment of my unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness by consensus and within the bounds of reason. But for now, the problem is, if I may borrow from Jefferson, that usually it is not until there is some disruption in the social continuum attributable to one or more of us in the underclass that those in power begin to pay heed to us. But by then it is too late. The revolution has already begun. Okay, so make no mistake about it, the world turns upon a perfect balance of peace and turmoil. And not only does the suffering of the underclass make great grist for radicals, politicians, and pundits alike, but our very existence sustains entire corporate state industries devoted to our maintenance. So who precisely are we, the underclass? What do we want, and what have we to offer? Primarily, what we have to offer is our tendency toward austerity. For example, I think that most Americans would agree that the typical American prison is by default extremely austere. That is, an inmate in a typical American state or federal prison lives and should expect to live under extremely austere conditions behind bars compared with those of us in civil society. Indeed, by our prison industry's own accounting, the lion's share of both money and resources spent on prisons goes to support the industry itself, not the prisoner. Similarly, contrary to popular myth, a family living on welfare exists in a far less luxurious condition, consuming far fewer resources than their consumer class overseers. As of 2016, Tompkins County, New York, a full-time Department of Social Services staff social worker as a member of the powerful and essentially exclusive Civil Services Employee Association earns $70,226.94 per year. Full retirement benefits after 20 years and under auspices of an agency called Greater Tompkins County Health Insurance Consortium, top-end Exelis Health Insurance. On the other hand, a social worker's clientele, let's say for the sake of comparison, a single parent working for a minimum wage earns $18,720 per year. And as anyone who holds a minimum wage job knows, a private sector employee is in no way legally bound to pay a dime above minimum wage to any employee ever. But moreover, the Federal Employee Retirement Income Security Act requires no private employer to establish a retirement plan on behalf of his employees. And the age of eligibility for Social Security retirement benefits is projected to increase by 2040 to 70 years of age. Now, thanks to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which President Obama signed into law back in 2010, at least the poor have a right to health care. But as I will explain in the following pages, ACA was no gift to the poor, and it comes with serious flaws. And if you happen to be part of another subset of the social workers' clientele, the disabled or young or old, or as they say in the advocacy business, at risk, forget about it. You are commodified. You're turned into fodder for the totalitarian corporate state, the welfare security state. Underclass. So what is underclass? The people who this word represents are real and have contributed profoundly to our evolution as a species. But according to sociologist Dennis Gilbert, ours, the underclass, is the absolute lowest class in the civilization's social hierarchy. Although we are estimated to represent only 12% of American households, I think this estimate does not tell the whole story. We in the underclass are the eccentric, the socially dysfunctional, socially deviant, degenerate, the undesirable, the criminal, the young, the old, the mentally divergent, and the racially and gender oppressed. Many in our class do not even live in what would ordinarily be thought of as quote-unquote households, unless an automobile or a cardboard box under a bridge or a prison qualify as such. Of course, they do not. Social eccentricity, or perhaps more accurately, the feeling of disenfranchisement that often accompanies social eccentricity, defies both racialization and income quantification. That is, although there are many who have gained wealth only to be left disappointed by it, membership in the underclass, just like membership in the consumer class and the capitalist class, is often both exclusive and generational. Although for many of us in the underclass, wealth is altogether elusive, it is never meaningless. Now, other than the two classes which occupy either end of the world's socioeconomic spectrum, the capitalist class and the underclass, there are other socioeconomic classifications that bear consideration. Most broadly speaking, the global consumer class and several subclasses such as the professional class, the working class, the newly emerging political class. But regardless of class, all of us hold some aspirations and sensibilities in common. So what is it that propels some to power over the rest of us? Is it ambition? First of all, let's get one thing out of the way. All of us must do some kind of work in order to survive on this planet. And whereas there are many without jobs for any number of reasons at any given time, the difference between work, the activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve a purpose or result, and a job, a paid position of regular employment, should not be understated. In today's global corporate economy, one's social status depends upon the profitability of the work that one does, not merely the nature of the work itself. As I will show you, class, the physical reality of one's class, and class consciousness, the state of mind of the classified individual, are imposed upon a people through social engineering, not self-imposed through subjective or collective disinterest in the process of social classification. So, while it is certainly true that we owe our standard of living today to many clever people who have come before us in history, why does the doomsday clock show 3 minutes until midnight as of January 26, 2016? Could it be that we've been following all the wrong leaders all this time, and with them the wrong collective ethos? That is, as a species, have we collectively and idiotically forsaken wisdom for guile, altruism for brinkmanship, truth for delusion, simplicity for complexity? What about the idea of divine providence? Are we predestined by God to the stations in life that each of us occupies, or are we rather like chess pieces moved here and there by the invisible hand of the marketplace, helplessly subject to the tendencies of supply and demand and the machinations of corporate state social engineering? Is there some cabal at work that throughout history has served to maintain power in the hands of a certain pedigree of human being at any cost, even to the destruction of our planet and the annihilation of our species? These are the questions I will try to answer in this book. So let's get going. Time is short. While it is true that some of the most profoundly influential and beneficial contributions to society have come from the underclass in all fields and disciplines, and that there have been people throughout history who have, through their own inventiveness and determination, risen from poverty to become great successes, captains of industry, political leaders, and so on, their importance should not be overstated. Underclass revolt is always near, simmering just beneath the surface of an illusorily tranquil landscape of so-called human progress. And our corporate state masters know it. The main barrier between our current condition and classless society is one of perception. There is a linguistic hedgerow separating the underclass from the upper classes, and although there is occasionally meaningful communication through the trees, as it were, usually when we in the underclass do speak, it is out of desperation, and it is not through our words that we speak, but through our actions in the form of violent revolt. Although I think I may say with confidence that rebellion and revolution have been part of the human experience from time immemorial, or at least from the onset of large-scale proto-civilization with the rule of law, sometime in the early Neolithic, I shall begin my test of history with the Helots of Messenia, who rose up against their Spartan masters in 464 BCE. Which means before the Common Era. Almost 300 years earlier, in 743 BCE, the Spartans and Messenians went to war over the taking of some cattle and some shenanigans with virgins in a temple. Actually, it was more than just some shenanigans. It was a massacre But the Messenians lost that war, but in 464 BCE, an earthquake struck the city of Sparta, reducing it to rubble, and in the aftermath of this calamity, the Messenians revolted. What is remarkable here, I think, is not so much what became of the Messenians or the Spartans. Today, both Messenia and Sparta exist pretty much as they always have, as a prefecture and a city, respectively, in the Peloponnesian region of southern Greece. No, what is remarkable here is how much crap people will take until they just won't take it anymore. What is remarkable about the Messenian revolt, and for that matter all revolts, popular or unpopular, is the lifespan of a vendetta. Now, not to diminish in any way the brutality and horror of slavery and the ill effects that the practice has wrought upon the world even to this day, but although it is often convenient to attribute underclass status to slaves and to the enslavement of Africans especially, it is important that we understand that the underclass has always been the domain not only of slaves but also of the socially peculiar, the maladaptive and the dysfunctional, in addition to chattel slaves who could provide an easy, immediate return on investment. As Victoria Bridnell, a paraplegic journalist writing in this New Statesman in 2008, said of the disabled in antiquity, the birth of a disabled child was regarded by the Romans as a great misfortune. A high percentage of disabled children were abandoned outdoors immediately after birth and left to die because many Romans felt it was pointless to prolong lives that could prove to be a practical and financial burden to the rest of the family. As Dionysius of Halicarnassos wrote about the founder of Rome, Romulus demanded that all the city's residents should raise all their male children and the firstborn of the girls and not kill any child under 3 unless the child was disabled. In this, we can at least see the emergence of a prototypical form of what might today be called child advocacy. Okay, so the meaning of success. Indeed, the 15th and 16th century age of sail was one of the most important eras in human history in determining our course as a species. And I do not believe that our development in this period was supernaturally predetermined. Social engineering, the decisions and actions of superheroic and anti-heroic humans, is what determines the course of history for the rest of us and for our progeny. Love them or hate them, it is the world's elites who gave us the age of discovery, the age of sail, and in the broadest sense, they know what we are going to do even before we do. Queen Elizabeth I was, of course, the daughter of the strong-headed King Henry VIII, who wrested political control of England from the Holy Roman Empire once and for all. First, by appointing himself supreme head of the church in England with the passage of his Act of Supremacy in 1434, and then with his dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, which, most importantly, ended the practice of collecting English taxes by the Catholic Church in England for the benefit of the papacy in Rome. Note here that in 1530, King Charles V of Spain was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Clement VII in Bologna, Italy. Now, Queen Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII's second wife, was executed in 1536 on dubious charges of adultery 2 years after giving birth to Elizabeth, so consequently, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. So I think it's kind of interesting that even today, children of families who don't comport with the classical sense of family are called illegitimate, as if there's something wrong with the child, which I think is an anachronism, to say the least. At that point, Elizabeth was placed in the household of her half-brother, Prince Edward, the only child of Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII's third wife, and raised by various governesses until King Henry's death in 1547, at which time Elizabeth was taken into the home of Henry VIII's widow and fourth wife, Catherine Parr, and her new husband, Thomas Seymour, who it was later discovered had sexually molested Elizabeth from the time she was 14. By the way, 16th century England's rape law, Westminster I, only applied to girls under 12 years of age. Nonetheless, for matters unrelated to his lust for the young Elizabeth, in 1549 Seymour was found guilty of treason and beheaded. Until her imprisonment in 1554, Elizabeth resided at least a part of the time at Hatfield House, a palace on the grounds of the Great Park on the eastern side of the town of Hatfield, Hertfordshire, England. The Hatfield House was built in 1497 by the Bishop of Ely, King Henry VIII's minister, Cardinal John Morton, and later seized by King Henry VIII with the passage of his dissolution of the monasteries. Yes, it is good to be the king. Time passed quickly and without relent for Elizabeth in those days. On August 3rd, 1553, Mary Tudor, the third daughter of King Henry VII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, became Queen of England and Ireland. Although arriving in London together in a show of unity amid much fanfare, Mary Tudor and her half-sister Elizabeth could not have been more at odds. For several hundred years, culminating in the 14th century, the papacy had begun to make a randy nuisance of itself in England and elsewhere, and thus, by the end of the 15th century, the Catholic Church, and for that matter, the Holy Roman Empire, had begun to disintegrate. Unfortunately for most Englanders, however, Mary of Tudor, from her mother's side, was a devout Catholic and wasted no time rounding up and burning at the stake hundreds of reformist Protestants. Her ruthlessness earned her the sobriquet Bloody Mary, and it was only a matter of time, the 18th of March, 1554 to be exact, until Elizabeth found herself imprisoned in the Tower of London, accused of giving aid to Wyatt's rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt of Kent, son of King Henry VIII's ambassador, Thomas Wyatt, having been informed of his father in letters from Spain in 1537 of rough treatment at and a narrow escape from the clutches of Spain's papal inquisitors, eventually found himself at the head of a rebel force of 4,000 men at arms in opposition to Queen Mary. But Wyatt's men were vastly outnumbered at Kingston, and he was forced to admit defeat. On April 11, 1554, Wyatt was beheaded, his head hung from a gallows on Hay Hill beside Hyde Park, London, and his limbs distributed to other gibbets about the city. At issue was Queen Mary's intention to wed Prince Philip of Spain, son of Charles V. The Inquisition was established in Spain in 1478 by Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, and with Queen Mary's marriage to Prince Philip, many English Protestants feared its impending arrival in England. After all, Jews and Muslims were not the only ones being targeted by Spain's Catholic oligarchy. So were Protestants, hence Wyatt's rebellion. Now, how Elizabeth Boleyn got mixed up in all of this is a matter of some debate among historians, and although it is known that the leader of the rebellion, not always Wyatt himself, had sought to depose Mary in favor of Elizabeth, and that Elizabeth was connected, at least coincidentally, with some of those men, including Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and even Thomas Wyatt himself, those men went to their deaths quietly, thus sparing Elizabeth's neck from the chopping block. At the behest of Baron William Paget of Beaudesert, a member of Queen Mary's Privy Council, Elizabeth was ordered released from prison and placed under house arrest at Woodstock, her procession cheered all the way by throngs of admirers. You get the feeling that in the years and months preceding Elizabeth's eventual rise to power, anyone even remotely near the center of English state affairs was perpetually within a hair's width of the axe, due mostly to the struggle of hegemony between the Catholic Church and the English state. Within this milieu, it appears that Protestantism was a means to an end. Like two galaxies on a collision course, for centuries Protestantism and Catholicism had been careening toward one another over Europe. We already know the role of King Henry VIII in subordinating the church to the English crown, but other factors, such as the displacement of English feudalism by English nationalism and the replacement of the papal canon law with English common law, cannot be understated in distinguishing the world we live in today from the Dark Ages. Although the Holy Roman Empire did find fertile ground east of the Danube under Theodosius I in 379 CE and later under Justinian I, had Attila the Hun not run short of supplies for his armies at Mincio in 1410 CE, and had Italy not been afflicted by a plague at the time, the predominant religion in St. Paul, Minnesota today might be Tengrism, not Protestantism. Okay. Aiding Queen Elizabeth's political acumen at home and England's survival, the Renaissance gave Queen Elizabeth a window to see beyond the religious superstition and an opportunity to parlay scientific advancements brought about by the Renaissance into a new age of discovery and newfound wealth across the Atlantic in America. Perhaps the most important technological advancements brought about by the Renaissance were in physics, munitions, geography, and maritime navigation. The sextant, compass, and astrolabe. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead to this section, to part 3, From Sea to Polluted Sea, A Tyranny of Systems. When in 1968, the Austrian-born biologist Carl Ludwig von Bertalanffy published his General Systems Theory, Foundations, Development, Applications, he well understood, and it was later expounded upon by others, how systems form and are formed, interact, and eventually degenerate, disintegrate, and end. In this context, there are 3 types of systems to consider. They are open, closed, and isolated systems. In the most general sense, Bertalanffy proposed that the characteristics which define these systems have to do with the degree to which they allow an exchange of both energy and mass through their boundaries. But the applicability of Bertalanffy's terminology to both natural and social systems was inescapable. Systems of all kinds can be readily verified, evidence produced showing that everything from the universe or multiverse down to the simplest atom is systematic. And since we are made of the same stuff as the universe, so are we. For our purposes, let's assume that all systems occurring in society are to varying degrees open systems. That is, they allow and are even dependent upon an exchange of both energy and mass through their boundaries, and for these social systems will also include ideas in the mix of commerce between them and their externalities. As of this writing, no one can say with any certainty whether the universe is an open, closed, or isolated system, for we still do not know, nor might we ever know, whence the boundary of our universe lies. But we can say with absolute certainty, for example, that the Republic of North Korea, in the sense that it is a political system, is extremely insular. Yet, in the sense that the sun still shines down upon the people of North Korea, and North Korea does engage in at least limited commerce with its neighbors, it is still an open system. And here in the U.S., we do not live in a completely open system, nor would we want to. Each of us and all living creatures have social boundaries. That is why we go to great lengths to keep wild animals and even uninvited humans out of our homes. So here the question is, insofar as each of us comprises a system unto ourselves and are composed of systems, even down to the atomic level, to what degree do each of us exist independently of larger external systems, families, neighborhoods, cities, states, the planet, the cosmos? Please remember while pondering this question that one of my main postulates in writing Dystopia is that all organizations are corrupt, and the bigger the organization is, the more corrupt it is. For example, the English Lord John Dalberg Acton wrote in his letter to the Archbishop of London, the Right Reverend Mendel Creighton, in 1887, that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And up to this point, in the sense that Dalberg Acton was speaking specifically to the essence of political power, I would agree with him. But I think he stops short of the mark, for I would posit further that anything that exists is corrupt. That is, nothing is perfect, save nothingness. And everything, or at least every living thing, wants to exist, and to exist under conditions which most favor its own existence. So at what point do civilizations, insofar as they are systematic, become tyrannical? At what point do systems overconsume their resources, exceed their boundaries, degenerate, disintegrate, and end? And is the process inevitable? Is humanity's end its manifest destiny? 10 months after announcing to Congress the Louisiana Purchase Treaty of 1803, President Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore, map, and most importantly, to establish by its presence a legal American claim to a land corridor all the way to the Pacific Ocean through territory which today comprises the state of Oregon, but which at that time Spain still clung to under Pope Alexander VI's bootless papal bull of 1493, granting Spain sovereignty over All islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered towards the west and south by drawing and establishing a line from the Arctic Pole, namely the north, to the Antarctic Pole, namely the south, no matter whether the said mainlands and islands are found and to be found in the direction of India or toward any other quarter. The said line to be distant 100 leagues toward the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde. Indeed, by 1803, the overextended Spanish Empire spanned the globe all the way from the Philippines to Florida, and included the entire western third of the continental North America, from Texas to British Columbia, an expansive land which at that time no cartographer could clearly envision. It was widely held among America's political elite back in Washington, D.C. at the time that the Louisiana Territory, which the U.S. had purchased from France for a nifty $15 million, $3 million in gold bullion, encompassed fully all territory west of the Mississippi to the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, from the 49th parallel in the north to the 29th parallel in the south, give or take a few tens of thousands of square miles. But the fulfillment of America's manifest destiny required more. By 1846, another war, the Mexican-American War, was underway. By 1819, Spain's empire was in tatters, with its government fragmented and financially exhausted by Napoleon's invasion and occupation of the Iberian Peninsula in 1808. Spain's King Ferdinand VII was ready to make a deal. Its North American holdings in Florida were sliding irrevocably into the hands of American settlers, and by 1810, nearly all of New Spain was either in revolt or on the verge of it. With General Andrew Jackson's de facto conquest of Spanish Florida via the pursuit of the insurgent Seminoles and their adopted African-American fugitive compatriots in the First Seminole War of 1817, then U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams realized the golden opportunity to further America's continental expansion. When Spain's ambassador, Luis de Onis, protested Jackson's invasion of Florida, Adams replied that Spanish Florida had become a derelict open to the occupancy of every enemy, civilized or savage, of the United States, and serving no other earthly purpose than as a post of annoyance to both nations. On February 22, 1819, Adams and de Onis signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which, under considerable duress, Spain ceded not only Florida, but also its feckless claims to the Oregon Territory along a stepwise diagonal border all the way from New Orleans. Then, with the Texas annexation of 1845, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo 3 years later, which concluded the Mexican-American War, and the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, America set its border with New Spain, Mexico, from the mouth of Rio Grande River at Brownsville, Matamoros on the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean at San Diego, Tijuana, conforming roughly with the 29th parallel north. Thus, America was officially born, a completely sovereign, contiguous nation from sea to shining sea. All that was left to do was to turn on the lights. Now, were I to suggest an invention of singular importance in bringing enlightenment to the Dark Ages, it would be Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press in 1450. I think it goes without saying that the two most important components of any modern civilization's infrastructure are communication and transportation. The age of discovery would not have been possible were it not for a means of printing and of disseminating ideas across regions. As it is in the nature of all living organisms to consume, venture forward, and to multiply, so it was in the people who came to America's eastern shore aboard wooden ships from Europe, except that our European forebears came with what they believed was a divinely inspired capitalist objective, and therefore one not based upon reason. They came with what they believed was a calling, quote unquote, from God. Indeed, our European forebears had the technological capacity to avail themselves of a vast continent brimming with natural resources and nothing in their way other than a disparate and primitive population of indigenous peoples over which they believed God had given them absolute dominion. 14 years After the close of the American Civil War in 1878, Thomas Alva Edison invented the light bulb that would produce light for 13.5 hours before burning out. And in the span of only another 3 years, Edison's Pearl Street Power Station in New York City was supplying electricity to 3,144 electric lamps in 203 Manhattan households and businesses. Never mind that even 11 years later, electric light had still not come to South Manhattan's Five Point District, where in 1889 the photojournalist Jacob Riis found the enclave's inhabitants sitting in pitch darkness amid dreadful squalor. By 1910, the lifespan of an Edison light bulb reached 1,200 hours, and 3 million people in the United States had electric lighting, turning night into day and transforming a nation of planters, distillers, and cottage tinkerers into the capitalist juggernaut and uncontested world superpower America is today. Now, surely America's manifest destiny was at hand. But here let's consider a couple of other technological advancements which preceded Edison's bulb, coming of age even at the height of the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history. They were the Morse-Veil telegraph, the Continental Railroad, and Drake's oil well. In 1861, 6 months after the Confederates fired the opening salvo in the American Civil War at Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina, President Lincoln received the country's first Continental telegram from Stephen J. Field, Chief Justice of California, from the headquarters of the Overland Telegraph Company in California in San Francisco. The Industrial Revolution would not have been possible without an effective means of communication and transportation across regions, and artificial light, but it also needed fuel, cheap, readily available, and continuous. Industrial whaling emerged with organized fleets in the 1600s as whale oil was discovered to be an effective source of fuel for lamps and a lubricant for machines. But by the early 19th century, kerosene had replaced whale oil as a fuel source, as it was cheaper yet to produce and even more abundantly available than whale oil. But with the advent of modern civilization, coal was king. Coal has been an important fuel source worldwide since the time of Marco Polo's adventure to China in the 13th century. Large-scale coal mining developed full bore beginning in the 19th century and remains to this day an indispensable source of energy, representing the third largest fuel source in the U.S., behind only petroleum and natural gas. Petroleum, in one form or another, has been used since ancient times. According to Sabit Bagaroff, president of the Center for Economic and Political Research and coordinator for the NGO Coalition in support of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative in Baku, Azerbaijan, there is irrefutable proof that 2,500 years ago, oil was exported from Baku to Iran, Iraq, India, and other countries. This was reported by such well-known historians and travelers as Prisk of Pontus, the 5th century, Abu Istkari in the 8th century, Ahmed Balazuri in the 9th century, Masudi in the 10th century, Marco Polo in the 14th century, and O'Leary in the 17th century. By 1825, Imperial Russia was producing 3,500 tons of oil annually, and by mid-century had doubled that output. And it was Polish pharmacist and petroleum industry pioneer Ignacy Lukasavage, but incidentally someone who I might be related to, since our names are similar, who developed the first modern oil refineries near Jaso, Poland in 1854-1856. But it was Edwin Drake's well near Titusville, Pennsylvania that launched the 19th century American oil boom and transformed the world. Edwin Drake was hired by the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company out of New Haven, Connecticut, to survey possible oil deposits near Titusville, Pennsylvania. And in the spring of 1858, 3 years before the onset of the American Civil War, Drake purchased a steam engine in Erie, Pennsylvania, and began drilling his well near Oil Creek, an Allegheny River tributary in northwestern Pennsylvania. It would be an expedition fraught with setbacks. At 16 feet, the sides of Drake's borehole began to collapse. Crowds of people began to gather and to jeer at the apparently failed operation, which they dubbed Drake's Folly. And further exacerbating Drake's efforts was the fact that he was also running out of money. Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company abruptly withdrew their interest in the project, leaving Drake to go hat in hand to two local businessmen, R.D. Fletcher and Peter Wilson, who agreed in a joint venture to lend Drake $500 to continue working. It was at this point that Drake came up with the idea of encasing his drill inside a cast iron drive pipe, which Drake and his men drove to 32 feet before striking bedrock. On August 27th, at a depth of 69.5 feet, Drake's bit broke through to a crevice, and oil began to rise to the surface. Legend has it that using only a hand pitcher pump, Drake and his men collected the oil in a bathtub. Suddenly, other prospectors began emerging from the woodline along Oil Creek, imitating Drake's drilling method, and by 1872, Pennsylvania's oil industry was pumping out 15.9 thousand barrels a day. Drake's well produced 25 barrels per day. As it was in those days of high-stakes venture capitalism, by 1863, we see poor Edwin Drake, with his health in steep decline, living in poverty with his wife Laura and 4 children in a New York City walk-up, having lost all his savings in the stock market. Then, in 1873, the legislature of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania caught wind of Mr. Drake's misfortune and, with remarkable reluctance, voted him and his wife Laura an annuity of $1,500. Edwin Drake died unremarkably on November 9, 1880, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. As of this writing, petroleum still represents America's biggest fuel source, a demand that U.S. Energy Information Administration foresees as increasing through 2040. According to U.S. EIA, we Americans consume 19.4 million barrels of oil a day to maintain our standard of living. In 2013, according to statistics from the U.S. Department of Transportation, 257 American motorists traveled 258 billion miles over 3.9 million miles of public roadway, enough pavement to reach to the moon and back 8 times. With German inventor Nicholas August Otto's invention of the first gasoline-powered engine in 1876 and Henry Ford's introduction of the Model T, mass-produced upon moving assembly lines at his Highland Park, Michigan plant beginning in 1913, the gas-powered automobile would become synonymous with the American way of life, profoundly and indefinitely transforming not only American transportation but industry itself, and all but obviating greener modes of public transportation such as passenger rail. According to the EPA, the average passenger car emits an average of about 5 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year, but emissions from all mobile sources, including trucks, buses, motorcycles, and off-road vehicles such as tractors, trains, and watercraft, present a real and seemingly intractable health hazard, especially for people living in urban areas, where they are routinely exposed to ground-level mobile source pollution. Although in the U.S., lead has been eliminated as a fuel additive in ground transportation, it's still used in aviation fuel. It's called avgas for small piston aircraft, which accounts for 50% of total emissions of airborne lead in the U.S. Other mobile source emissions which EPA classifies as hazardous air pollutants include, mobile source meaning cars, include benzene, ethyl benzene, acetaldehyde, acrolein, toluene, naphthalene, N-hexane, butadiene, styrene, xylene, methyl tert butyl ether, benzoate-pyrene, arsenic, and formaldehyde. Indeed, EPA's master list of compounds emitted by mobile sources for the year 2006 counted 1,162 chemical compounds in mobile source emissions. That's what we're breathing every day when we're walking around on the street every day. That's the stuff that the automobile industry is forcing us to breathe in complicity with local government. That is not because EPA determined conclusively that the remaining 975 compounds are not toxic, but because they simply do not know whether they are. The bottom line here is that for the most part, nobody really knows what effects chemicals either used in or that are the byproducts of industry and commerce have on human health. Yet we continue to produce more of them every day than we have the capacity to control. According to U.S. Centers for Disease Control, there are more than 480,000 deaths attributable to cigarette smoking in the U.S. each year, as CDC's figures from 2009. But the operative word in this statement is attributable. Anyone can attribute any effect to any cause that they want to. but that does not make what they are saying true, exclusive of all other variables. Overall, the number of disease-related deaths in the U.S. each year, according to CDC's numbers, is about 900,000. But whereas only 1 out of 20 Americans smoke cigarettes, according to U.S. Bureau of Transportation statistics in 2014, there were 260,350,938 registered vehicles on the road, meaning that 81.7% of Americans drive, thus producing far more carcinogenic pollution than raising cattle or smoking tobacco ever could. And still, there is no end in sight to an automotive industry that contributes 3 to 3.5% of U.S. gross domestic product. Today in the U.S., automobile advertising comprises a $14 billion industry, second only behind total retail. And in 2012, per Kantar Media Intelligence, U.S. automakers aired 12.7 million television advertisements at an estimated cost of $9.4 billion. Even with the emergence of digital media, television still ranks number one as the medium of choice among auto sales executives.